So today I'm going to be talking about improving experiences, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about UX and content strategy. And I talk about this from a front-end developer perspective, because I'm a front-end developer at heart. My name's Suzanne Dergacheva, and I'm one of the co-founders of Evolving Web. We're a Drupal agency in Montreal. And I'm also on the board of the Drupal Association, so everything that Adam was talking about this morning about, building a stronger community and things that the Drupal Association should do to support the community, I would love to hear what you all think about that. So I also train people how to use Drupal on all kinds of different topics. I love teaching Drupal. I love sharing what I know. And if you want to stay in touch, you can always email me or follow me on Twitter or on the Drupal Slack, pixelite is my handle. And those are just some of the trainings we have coming up about Drupal accessibility and Drupal 8 in Ottawa. So to get right into it, so when I talk to people in the web development world, when I talk to front-end developers and back-end developers, a lot of them are really passionate about what they do and really passionate about the technology that they're using. And often on projects, we get started working on a website or an app, and we're really into the technological solution, like how are we going to solve this problem, or what module are we going to use? But in fact, a lot of times on a project, the success factor for whether we accomplish what we set out to achieve is not that the technology is really like we've chosen the right solution or that what we've done is technologically elegant. A lot of the times what we do is actually judged more on the design side. And I used to be really frustrated by that. I used to be frustrated that people would look at some website we had built and the website would do all kinds of amazing things behind the scenes. But we hadn't spent time on the design, and it didn't look so impressive, and it didn't have that polish. And so it was judged to be less good because of that. And this used to really frustrate me. And now, these days, I sort of am leaning in the other direction, and I'm starting to think that, in fact, maybe the design is more important than the technology. And when I say design, I don't necessarily mean like the nice gradient in the background of the slide, or the choice of colors, or that something is really well illustrated or has amazing branding. When I talk about design, I'm talking more about the user experience design that goes into a project, as well as the content strategy, and the two kind of go hand in hand. So I think as developers these days, especially as front-end developers who are making really a lot of choices about design, it's important to have at least a base understanding of what good user experience design should be, and some techniques that we can use to actually create better user experiences and implement better content strategies. So that's sort of what I'm going to be walking through today, is how to do this from a developer perspective. So when you start out thinking about user experience design and building a strategy for what kind of design you're going to implement, the first thing to think about is what the overlap is between the business goals of the project you're working on and what users actually want. So it's great to build something that users want. If we could just build cool little tools that people like, that's always fun. But there has to be this overlap also between what you're trying to achieve as a business, or maybe you're not a business, you're a government, or you're an organization, or you're a university. But whatever your goals are, whatever your vision is, whatever your purpose is, that has to somehow overlap with what users want. And if it doesn't overlap, then you're out of luck. So you need to find this overlap, and that's really a hard part and a good place to start when you're planning a project. So even if you're a developer coming to a project, you might come to a project and there's already been a design done, or there's already been work done to start the planning. And you might realize that this overlap doesn't exist. And even as a developer, maybe design isn't actually your responsibility, but you should still call this out and flag this as a problem. So the actual fact is that there's not just this simple overlap of what users want and what businesses want, because users want different things. And this is why it's hard. If it was just the first diagram, it would be easy. We just have this one user, and then this one business, and then what's the overlap? Done. But in fact, you always have, for any product, any project, you have different kinds of users. So you might have some users who are looking for information. You might have some users who are actually just trying to get in and out and do one transaction. You might have people who are finding your content in different ways, maybe some through a Google search, maybe some through your front door. Maybe you have internal users and external users, and they have really different needs. And so this makes the job much more complicated, and it often makes it less clear that there's something missing. So in this picture, if you start off on a project and you realize, well, the business is trying to achieve this, and there's actually no way for users to let them achieve that, then that's a problem. But when a business is trying to achieve many things, and then users are trying to achieve many things, this is when the challenges come in. So that's why we kind of need some tools to go in and actually do an assessment. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples today. So first of all, we work with a lot of universities. So I have a couple university examples. Is anyone here at a university? Oh, good. Okay, perfect. So hopefully this will speak to some of you. So usually when we go in on a project and we're trying to figure out what the business wants, we ask these three simple questions: what, how, and why. And a lot of project planning and a lot of user experience work starts out with this same methodology. And the idea is to really take a step back and not to start with like, oh, we're trying to build a website, but more just like, what are we actually trying to achieve here? And the difference between these questions, the what is kind of like, what does the organization do? So if you're, maybe if you're a governmental organization, you're trying to provide information, and you need to communicate with the public. If you're a university, you obviously have an interest in serving your students, so preparing students for the world. When we talk to this school, this is a school at Princeton University, one of their goals is to actually inform the public and to give information to the press and policymakers, which is something that kind of makes them a little bit unique. So beyond just serving the student needs, they have this more external role in thought leadership and influencing policymakers. And then the how is more about what techniques they use to do that. So a school, they're building a curriculum and they're sharing research. And then the why is always the harder question. It's like, what is the greater purpose of why you do what you do? And this can sometimes be really hard for businesses to answer. This usually goes into like the vision or mission statement of an organization. So what is this organization trying to achieve? Well, they're trying to build the change makers of tomorrow, the future leaders, and they're trying to make the world a better place. So that's kind of a hard thing to solve. And by stepping back and asking these questions, you can better figure out who you're trying to speak to. So by asking these questions, we were able to figure out that, the school is not just trying to talk to students, but actually to a broader public, and that audience is really key to the school meeting its goals. And the website is actually a key communication piece for the school to communicate with the wider world. Students, you can maybe send them emails, you can maybe reach them in person, but the broader public is only going to see the school perhaps from the filter, the lens of the website. So then we get a little bit more practical, and we start to think about who, the who question, like who is actually coming to this website, and we build up a set of personas. So this is a really common technique in user experience design, and the goal here is to be able to do some storytelling. So personas are not actual people. they're kind of, they represent, the different personalities, the different types of users who are going to be coming to the website. And the benefit of this, of having kind of these imaginary characters, is that you can add details into these persona profiles that describe a little bit more the goals, and you can kind of summarize the goals of a whole group of people. So for a university website, you typically have students, and you have staff, and then you have the broader public, you have faculty, and those tend to be the personas that we think of. But of course, we could break those down a bit further. So students, that's a very general term. You could be a student for 30 years of your life if you think about it. So there might be freshmen, there might be undergrads, graduate students, there might be students who are prospective students applying to the university, or current students. And so in this case, we broke it down a little bit, and we tried to guess who the most important personas were. And this is where we started. We thought, okay, it's going to be alumni, it's going to be current students, like a current master's student, a grad student, or prospective grad student, freshman. So we had kind of these different personas that we developed. And we had, one of the most interesting conversations you can have is sitting down and actually going through these personas and saying, which ones are the most important? And this is a hard question to ask, but when we think about it from our perspective as front-end developers, if you think about actually taking some content and putting it on a page, or deciding which block should actually be the most important thing, what can be prioritized if I'm ordering content, knowing who you're building the website for is key to making all those decisions. And so in having a conversation, we actually got different stakeholders in the room and different users in the room, people who are actually using this website, and we talked to them about who are all these personas, first of all, what motivates them, but then which ones are the most important. And we were surprised to find that the press and the policymakers were actually a really important audience, maybe even more important than the prospective students who were selecting the school. And that goes back to the mission, the why statement about really trying to change the world and influence policy. So another really fun thing you can do when you're building personas, and this is something you don't always have the time or the privilege to do, but by interviewing people, interviewing somebody who falls into one of those audiences, you can actually ask them their story. And the advantage of an interview is that you really get more at the motivations and the journey. So when you send out a survey, or when you're just kind of observing people through analytics, you get data. You tend to get a lot more data, and you can see, these people are accessing this page, and then they click on this link, and you can kind of draw some conclusions from that. But in an interview situation, you can actually hear how the person's interaction with the website fits into their larger journey. And you can hear more about how their perspective changes maybe as they're using the website. So one example of this from the project I was talking about is that students, maybe when they're researching what school they want to go to, maybe the first time they visit the website, they're doing some broader research. They're just comparing school to school. So if I'm thinking about applying to a graduate program, I'd imagine opening up 10 tabs in my browser, right, from the schools that I've heard of, and kind of flipping through the different program profiles and seeing how they compare. Maybe making, if I'm really feeling ambitious, I'll make a spreadsheet that kind of compares the facts and figures and how long these programs are and what benefits they have. And then maybe I'll come back and I'll apply to 3 schools. So that might be the way that my journey evolves. I start off with this broader research, and then I go back to actually apply. So I'm always a prospective student, but I'm using the website in different ways to reach my goal. And that's some information that you can get out of interviews that would be hard to get from another method of research. Surveys are also really valuable because surveys are easier to conduct. It's easier to send out a survey to a bunch of students and get them to spend a few minutes filling in some multiple choice questions. So you can get a broader reach. And you can also kind of cast the net a bit wider. So if you're not even sure how to define the personas in the first place, or what users are trying to do on the website currently, a survey is a really great way to gather that information. And it's also a good method to use when you don't have access to your users. So sometimes your website will have a very specific target, and it will be hard to get those people you're targeting in the room. It'll be hard to get those sample users to participate. So surveys are a great way to gather information. So once you kind of know who you're designing for and what their priorities are, another useful method of user experience research or user experience work is to do element gathering. And element gathering, I mean, it's a very generic term. You might call this content gathering or just doing a content audit. And it consists of taking all the possible content. Like, it's a really green light exercise where you're not putting the brakes on, you're not saying no to anything, you're just saying what's all the potential content we could possibly have on this website. And we call it element gathering because it's not just restricted to content, you might also talk about features. So we're not, like, when I talk about this with developers, they're always keen on, like, well, that's not a piece of content, that's a view, or that's gonna be a form, or we're not gonna implement it like this. So it's not the time to think about how you're gonna implement things, it's time to just think about what are all of the possible things. And so element gathering should cast the net broadly. So what we do is we take probably all of the content you have already. That's a good place to start if you have a website you're building from, a legacy platform or something you're improving. And then you might take all the things your competitors have that you're like, oh, well, that would be fun to do. Like, that would be fun to have these long form stories, or it would be great if we had profiles of students, or maybe we could get more research online and we could organize the content like this, or maybe we want to have that podcast. So you brainstorm all these things that your competitors are doing, and then you take all the feedback that you've heard from in the surveys when you asked what could we add to the website, what does the website not do that you wish it did, and all those interviews that you did when people were talking about their journey and what content could have supported their decisions. You take all of that information and you add it to the element gathering. And you take special care for each persona to think about what the person is trying to achieve, what tasks do they want to do on the website. And you make sure that all of those things are represented in your element gathering. And the element gathering, we take these elements and we usually put them, you might put them in a spreadsheet, because you kind of love spreadsheets. But you can also put them on little sticky notes or on cards like this. And physically having them represented like that is great, because then you can start to have conversations where people are involved and you're actually moving these things around. So the competitive research part of this is really important. And this is often something that you can do as a front-end developer, you can do it as a designer, whoever is leading the project, maybe the client who's actually stakeholders who are making the decisions, maybe they have ideas. But looking at other representative projects that are similar is a great way of figuring out what kind of content you need. And I love this quote, that the last best experience anyone has anywhere becomes the minimum expectation for the experience they want everywhere. So people are comparing the experience that you're building to other experiences. And it's not that everyone has to go out and build the same thing, but by kind of looking at what content and what features other people offer, and just building that into this content gathering exercise, you'll open yourself up to building a better product. So we take all these elements that we've gathered, and we do what's called an element sorting. And in this process, what happens is you have all these distinct pieces, and you're trying to organize them in a way. And this is a really challenging thing for people to understand. So a lot of the times when you tell people to sort, they start to sort maybe by how their organization is organized, like the organizational structure. Like you start to think, yeah, like, oh, I have all these pieces of content. It's this one department that is in charge of them. So let's put those together. So it's really important for the element sorting that you do this with the lens of the personas, that you're actually thinking of the personas when you're doing this, and you're thinking of the most important personas first. So it's not a question of how would we as an organization structure this content, but it's how would this user like to see this content? How would they go about finding it? And when they're finding that content, what other content would support their decisions and their tasks? So that's how you have to kind of think about it when you're going through and grouping content together. Another important thing is that you don't have to think about element sorting as creating a sitemap. It's true that after this exercise, you'll probably go and create a sitemap. But when you're showing people content, it's not like they're always going to find content by walking through your navigation. They might find content in other ways. There might be ways of bringing content into a section of the website without necessarily having it be there in the menu. So you're really thinking now in a more theoretical sense of how the content should be organized. So the sticky notes are nice because people just love sticky notes. But also people love multicolored sticky notes. And when I do this exercise, I try and color code the sticky notes so that they match the personas. So when you're writing down on a card, like, oh, this is content that a user wants to see, maybe prospective students want to find out about scholarships, right? So if you write the scholarship sticky note on a blue sticky note, and that represents potential students, then you'll be able to visually see, when you do this sorting exercise, how the interests of different personas are concentrated. So you'll see, oh, there's a lot of blue over here, there's a lot of orange over here, and this is how the different users are walking through the website. And then here's one section where there's all the colors together. So there might be certain sections like maybe a section about the programs, or maybe a section about alumni, where you'll find actually there's people interested in this from different personas. And so we need to make sure that this content actually speaks to all these different groups. So sitemaps are useful. As a front-end developer, I'm not going to start working on a project until I can see a sitemap, right? I want to know what are all the content types. I want to be able to figure out what views I need to create, what the overall navigation is, how many menus and front-end elements I'm going to have. But a sitemap is kind of limited, like an old school sitemap where we're like, oh, here's just a picture of all the pages. That's not so useful. These days we use a tool called FlowMap. Does anyone use FlowMap? Yeah, it's great. You have to pay for it. I have to start paying for it, and I'm always like, oh, is this really worth it? But it is so worth it, up until now anyway. And the nice thing about this tool is that you go in, and on each kind of node in the sitemap, on each element, you can go and document, and you can comment, and you can have a conversation about the content and the purpose of that page. And it's not so much filling in all the details like you would do in wireframing, it's a step before that. And this is where the content strategy comes in. So when we're just talking about overall structure like this, you can kind of see like, oh, we're going to have a section for programs and admissions, and we'll have, of course, our about section, and then there's a great place to highlight all the research and the podcasts and all of this. But then what language are we actually going to put into those pages? And how does the content break down on each of those pages? That's a conversation we start having at this phase. So we start to say, okay, this section we know is most useful to these personas. So we have to talk about the content in a certain way and add interface text that speaks to those people. And it's also the point in the conversation where the developers are really involved. So even if so far, it was the content strategist and the designer and the UX person who were involved in the workshops and the research, at this point, you definitely need to get the front-end developers in there, the back-end developers in there to say, well, how does this content actually appear on this page? If there's a list of user profiles, like which users are we showing here? Or if we're going to display all these different types of pages about different kinds of diverse programs, how can we make them consistent enough that this site will be maintainable and make sense from a Drupal perspective? Or is all this stuff translated, or how are we going to get it all translated? So these are the types of questions you want to start asking at this point. And I think it's actually some of these questions then end up going back into the UX process. So sometimes, a designer is going to make a lot of assumptions about how data gets onto a page, and the answers to the questions that the developers ask are actually important at this step. So the role of content strategy on in a project like this is to really pinpoint certain elements of the interface, certain elements of the experience that you're building. And I think these are the top 4 places that I would say content strategy plays a real role. First of all, in the messaging. So what is messaging? Messaging is like how everything we talked about at the beginning about the why, the what, the how, it's how that gets communicated subtly through a website. And some of that comes in through branding and just the visuals. So maybe you're trying to be a really diverse, you're saying this school is really diverse, this school is really international. Maybe there's images that you use to support that and visuals that come through in the design. Or maybe you have some kind of look and feel elements, like the amount of white space you have, the amount of lighter images versus darker images. Those are communicating the messaging of the organization. But there's also a lot that comes through just in the actual text that's written. So messaging is important, and messaging always is going to tie back to who you're talking to. So when you're talking to 3 different types of users, maybe prospective students, current students on the public, those people are going to want to hear different messaging. And so this is when that consideration comes into play. So when you're working on any kind of website project, there's this interplay between the content and the design, right? So what comes first? Who thinks content comes first? Who thinks design comes first? Oh no, he thinks design. But then how do you know? How do you know what content you need to write if you haven't done the design? Right? So if you say, oh yeah, content person, just go away and write me some content. Who's ever done this? Like you've gone and ordered some copywriting. You all have to write the copy yourselves? No. Who's ever gone and said, okay, go off content editing team and write me some landing pages? How does that go? Yeah, sometimes you come back with all kinds of text, like really long text, or like, oh, I really want to get these banners created. Go write me some text for the banners. And then you get hundreds of characters. And oh, this isn't going to fit into the design. So I think that design and content is often a back and forth. And that's why it's really good to get on the same page. Get the designers, get the content people on the same page about what the messaging is, and do this actually in a bit of an iterative process. So you come up with some messaging, you get that into the design, and then you kind of iterate back. And this can be done as part of the wireframing process. User journeys are also part of a content strategy, so figuring out what blocks of content people need to see in what order. So thinking through, like, here's this whole page about how to apply to a school. Okay, well, I'm going to walk through, and I'm going to need to know something about the process before I actually start. That's something that you might want to do user testing for if it's a really important process like admissions. Supporting content, so what kind of related content do people need to see, and what examples do they want to see? So if I'm a student, a prospective student, I probably want to see some current students, some profiles of current students, and I want to see what type of people are getting into this school. So I might want to see some statistics about that. Whereas if I'm a member of the public, maybe I would rather be interested in some professors and what kind of research that they're doing and draw conclusions from that, or find an expert. If I'm a member of the press and I want to speak to some faculty at this school. So that kind of supporting content is going to change maybe depending on the audience that that section of the website is built for. And then prioritization, that's all around ordering. So when we think about, like, how do we decide what comes first, or if you have a view and you're literally building in the sort criteria and the filter criteria, those are going to influence the usefulness of the website for different personas. So are people most interested in the most relevant content, the featured content, the most recent content? Do we need to prioritize the content based on different taxonomy terms? That's going to change depending on who you're talking to. So another school that we've worked with recently on their UX strategy is McGill. We've been working with the Des Hotels faculty, so it's the business school at McGill, and we have been helping them figure out who their students are. They have some new programs, so it's like, who are these people who are applying to these new master's programs, and how to speak to them about the content of the programs, the curriculum, the selling features. And these, as being master's programs, they're maybe not as predictable as a typical, like, undergrad program. These are maybe professionals who are applying, and they're doing a lot of work to compare different schools because a business program is expensive. And they're comparing in different ways. So in a way, like, McGill is this very prestigious organization, but they also want to attract the best, and they don't just want to attract people who think that this is an expensive school and I can pay the price tag. They want to attract really, like, the talent from around the world and have a really international cohort. So when we worked with them, we went out and interviewed different prospective students, and we interviewed current students who had just finished this applications process, and we talked to them about what they were looking for and how they were comparing schools. And then how does this research kind of come back and influence the project? So in terms of the messaging, kind of the first thing I was talking about, the actual tone of the content is going to change depending on who you're speaking to. Are you speaking to an undergrad? Are you speaking to a graduate student? Are you going to be focusing more on the career journey, or are you going to be focusing more on the experience? So we found that the messaging really had to change depending on the audience. User journeys and click paths. So we found that, like, this school, this business school, they have a lot of information about the research that they're conducting. A lot of really interesting, like, technology that they have available for students. There's all these resources that are mentioned, and it's all very compelling, really. But that content was not really well integrated with the applications process. So I think that maybe the school didn't realize that students, potential students, were coming to this content and actually seeing it as a way, like as research that they're doing to support their applications process. So there wasn't a good user journey from all of that research information to the applications process itself. So there were some user journeys that had holes in them, some click paths that didn't exist. Supporting content is always really important. So if you're a student doing this kind of research, what schools am I going to apply to? You're really looking for yourself. You're seeing, do I fit? Can I see myself at this school? So when we were talking about putting in maybe some kind of supporting information about existing students, putting in profiles that would relate to the target students that the school is searching for seemed like a good idea. This is actually not from a school website. It's for the Trudeau Foundation, their scholar program. So it's a similar kind of use case where like profiles of people in the program are going to help attract the right candidates. And then content prioritization. So this is the homepage of the Harris School. They're on Drupal as well. They're a public policy school. And they have this really nice video up at the top of their page, and then you just scroll down a little bit and there's these great, really visual elements. And it's a combination of things like news and blog posts and events and videos, and the way that they prioritize the content is interesting. So they might prioritize it to show more information about the applications process or more kind of about what the initiatives are of the school. And I've come back to this page many times, and what I see there is different. I assume it's being ordered by what's most recent. But every time I come back, well, it's been a few times, there's been something different, and it's completely changed my impression of the organization. So the first time, I think I saw a lot of information about the admissions process. There was a blog about a student like going through this admissions process. And it really made me think of this as like, oh, I could apply to this school. And then coming back and seeing more about the news and the initiatives and the research, I was thinking more like, oh, they're doing some interesting research, like maybe I want to read more about what they're doing. So the way that that content gets organized and prioritized is a simple thing. It's filtering the content, but it had a huge impact on my my first impressions. So user testing, who here has conducted user tests before? Oh, great. Or how many of you have just like watched somebody else use the website that you built? Yeah, sometimes it's a little painful, right? Like, oh, that menu's harder to use than I thought. So user testing is always a valuable thing to do. I find that it is something that takes time, of course, and depending on the project, depending on who your target users are, can take a lot of work to just recruit people to be test subjects. And so it's something that you really have to do strategically. So it's not just like, oh, we're gonna go and test everything at every stage, and we're gonna get 20 people to do the test. Like that's a lot of work. So you really have to think more about what are the unknowns. What do you need to test? So one really easy test to do is a tree testing, where you have just at the sitemap stage where you're figuring out the overall architecture, you ask people to think about, okay, what if I built out this kind of information architecture, this kind of sitemap, would people be able to find the page where they're going to find the content? So you give a simple instruction like, please find information about this scholarship, and then you get the users to go through and you see which page they land on and which page they select as like, I would find the content in here. So it's an easy test to run. You can send out the links if you're doing it online like this to a few people, and it just takes a few minutes to complete. So it's a really low barrier to entry. And you can figure out quickly whether the the labeling that you've chosen for the sitemap makes sense, the terminology that you use, and if people can find the content in the right place. So we did this to figure out kind of how to organize the admissions and programs section, because there was a lot of overlapping content between those sections. We wanted to make sure that if we changed the structure, that people would still be able to find the content. Another kind of testing you can do is wireframe testing. So testing wireframes is easier than testing, well, it's harder than testing a finished product, because a finished website, it works, right? You can just give people the link and say, oh yeah, just click around and do this task. Wireframes, you have to do a little bit more work to piece the wireframes together so that people can have that experience. But if you do user testing at the wireframe stage, then you'll actually have time to go through and implement changes. Whereas if you wait until the finished product, then you'll have to go back and convince everybody, oh, we have to change all that thing that we built. So this is supposed to be a video, but it doesn't seem to be working. It's just too bad. So it's actually, like, I can mime it. Like, okay, so you flip. So the user is actually just using their finger to go through on the application and click things. And then the person conducting the test is just flipping the pages and to simulate the actual interface. So they were just able to draw this. Of course, you can use tools like InVision to do simple prototyping of a website. InVision usually works really well because you can link up different wireframes together. If you have something more interactive, like, oh, somebody has to be able to drag and drop this element and move it, then InVision I don't think is going to support that unless they've just added this feature. So there's more complicated tools like Azure, where you're actually kind of building some of the JavaScript in to simulate the animations and interactivity. I find that like a lot of work to do to just set up a user test. So this wireframing with the paper works pretty well. If you wait until until you actually have a prototype or more of a finished product, it's nice. You can kind of give somebody a more complete experience and get feedback on the overall feel. But then the trade-off is that, it will take probably more time to integrate that research back into your product. And so this is something to do maybe more if you have already built the product and you're looking to make improvements of a certain section and you want to know how to do that. Or if you're looking more to change the tone of the content. That's something that's kind of easier to do after you launch. If you're looking for feedback on the visuals or something more about the features that you want to add. Sometimes you come back later and you say, oh, we need to add an advanced search interface, or we're going to add this extra feature that's in phase 2. So that's a good thing to test with a kind of more of a working prototype. Another way of testing a full user experience is to test with your competitors' websites. So going back to that quote about building, people's user expectations, they're looking to their minimum expectation is the best user experience they've ever had. So you might assume like, oh, our competitor has this fancy new website, so let's build that. That's clearly the best user experience out there. Yeah, so but that's an assumption. So like I'm done some work recently testing the admin UI for Drupal, and everyone's like, oh, well, we should build in tools that work like Gutenberg, or we should integrate Gutenberg into Drupal because that's the best experience out there. People love Gutenberg. But unless you test that other platform, you don't know that it's the best. And you don't know that it's the best for your users because maybe those users have a little different needs or different use cases. So testing your competitors' websites is easy to do. They already launched their website, right? So you just take it and watch how people use it and see what patterns work, what patterns do people like, what messaging speaks to people, and what is harder to use. So you can learn from their mistakes. And then last UX technique I'll talk about, this is a fun one, heuristic evaluation. So fancy word just meaning getting the expertise of your community of people who kind of know about user experience. So getting feedback from not users, but people who work a lot with users. So these are some little snapshots from an event that I run at Evolving Web called Evolve UX, and it's a UX meetup that we do where we have demos of products. So people come in with their work in progress and they do a demo. So again, maybe it's a wireframe, maybe it's a prototype, maybe it's a finished, launched website. And they just do a quick demo, and then the crowd gives the feedback. So you talk about, what are the impressions, what did I like about this, and what are some things that don't make sense, what are questions that come up when you see an interface. And just getting this quick feedback in those 3 rounds, the impressions, what I like, what I would want to change, it uncovers some really interesting results, often some really insightful feedback. And you're kind of, again, casting the net really wide. Like, what's all the reactions from all these people who are seeing an interface for the first time? So it takes some kind of guts, I guess, to get up and just present something you're working on to a crowd of strangers. But I find it a really useful process, and if you don't have time to do any of the other UX techniques, then it's a nice way to get information really quickly. So I'll just leave you with a couple final thoughts. So when you're thinking about, when you're working as a front-end developer and you're assessing a design that comes onto your desk, or you're implementing something, there are many factors that influence UX. So here are some of the most important. You, of course, have navigation. This is the #1 thing we see when we're looking at pain points on interfaces, like the information's hard to find, how you emphasize things, the labels, what you call things. All of the content affects UX. So UX and content are like this, like really go hand in hand. And then layout and proximity of elements, which always speaks to the importance. And then when a user is assessing their experience, so if you're trying to pretend, like putting on the lens of the user, trying to think through what the user is experiencing, it can be hard. I mean, you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So remember, there tends to be some expectations about a website. And so someone's usually assessing their experience based on how long things take, like loading time. That's a huge thing for user experience that sometimes gets ignored. We as front-end developers have a big influence on page loading times, so that's something to take into consideration. And then things like predictability of the experience, so how similar it is to other experiences, how easy it is, or how complicated. The simplicity should go hand in hand with how difficult the task is. So applying to a university is harder than just going and looking up one piece of information on a website. So there's going to be more steps, but you still don't want it to be extremely complicated. Tone, which comes through the messaging, the content, the images, that's really important. Empathy is hard to measure. It's like how much the user feels a fit, how much they see themselves in the interface. And then success and failure. So as a developer, somebody can fill out their form and hit submit and it seems to work. That is going to be a good experience. If they hit submit and they get a big error message there, if it's a fail, then it's a bad experience. So like I said, getting the design right might just be more important than the technology, even if we're developers. And so I hope you found some of these insights useful, and I hope you're able to do more UX. That's all I have. Thank you. And I don't think I left time for questions. I'm sorry. But I would love to stay here and answer questions. So if you have any questions, come find me. And I'll also be out there, I guess, in that booth or something over lunch. I don't know.